Hello, and welcome to our conversation on Secure by Design, a proactive approach to open source health and security. I'm Donald Fisher. I'm one of the co-founders and CEO of Tidelift. As many of you know, Tidelift, we're an organization that works directly with independent open source maintainers to help them ensure that their software projects meet defined secure development standards. And as part of our work, we've had the great opportunity to correspond with and interact with a number of leaders in the US government initiatives around software security generally and open source software specifically. And so I'm excited to welcome today two of those leaders to join us for this conversation. Hey, would you like to introduce yourself to start off?
Sure. Thanks for having me, and good to see you again, Donald. I had a great time last time I was at Upstream. I'm Ava Black. I'm the section chief for open source security at CISA. So I work really closely with Jack here, and kind of just come from a background of about 25 years working in open source, and then bringing that knowledge to trying to help CISA.
And Jack.
Great. And first of all, thanks so much for having us here, Donald. Excited to talk a bit about CISA's work around Secure by Design and open source security. I'm Jack. I'm a senior technical advisor here at CISA, where I help lead both our work around Secure by Design and then with Ava, our work on open source software security. And come from a background in security research and software development. Found my way over to the policy side a couple of years ago, spent some time on the Hill working on areas including open source software security policy, and joined CISA a little bit over a year ago.
Perfect. Well, welcome both. We're, again, excited to have you here representing this voice of the public sector in our conversations here today at Upstream. So maybe just get the ball rolling. Our session today is about Secure by Design. And we note that CISA recently celebrated the first anniversary of its Secure by Design initiative. Just a couple of weeks ago at the RSA conference, I had the opportunity to join a session where many software companies, including Tidelift, signed a Secure by Design pledge, demonstrating or attesting their efforts to adopt some of these principles that are under this banner. So maybe to get things rolling, could we start with an explanation of what is Secure by Design, what's meant by that concept, and maybe even just to fill in one other ingredient, what is CISA, and what is the role of CISA, and how does that tie into the Secure by Design initiative?
Yep, and maybe I'll start with the latter one first, just so everyone knows who we are. So we are CISA, the U.S. Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. We like security so much, we put it in our name twice. But really what we are is we're the nation's civilian cyber defense agency. So we're concerned with both protecting the federal civilian government as well as the United States' critical infrastructure. So that's everything from power plants to water systems, to schools, to elections, to banks, and so on. Everything that we need to function in our daily lives. And at CISA, we want to help make sure that we can continue to rely on this essential infrastructure. And kind of where the Secure by Design perspective comes in is that we recognize that the state of security is only going to get more and more critical. We are only going to see more and more, whether it's ransomware or nation state backed attacks. We're only going to be seeing more kind of damage done to critical infrastructure, to the American public. And what it comes back to is that we have technology, software underpinning our critical infrastructure, really our global infrastructure, that we need to ensure security is built in from the start. And at CISA, we've spent a lot of time thinking about other industries, and in pretty much every industry reaches a point where security safety becomes a core consideration because the kind of lack of that thought leads to too much damage. So if we think about the auto industry, and for instance, in the 100 or so years, 100 plus years since we've had cars, we saw that we went from this thought that unsafe driving was the cause of many of these accidents and casualties that occurred, when in reality, we now know that the manufacturers of cars can do quite a bit to make that a safer experience for their drivers, for their riders, by doing things like seatbelts and airbags and so on, that seem like very common sense approaches today. But even, I don't know, 50, 60 years ago, they weren't that. And thanks to things like Ralph Nader, Unsafe at Any Speed, we did get some monumental improvements, both when it comes to how we're thinking about kind of who really has the responsibility here, but then also about what sorts of actions car manufacturers can and should be taking when it comes to building safety into their products. So at CISA, we think it's time for the software industry to undergo the same transformation to make safety and security and quality a key consideration. And that's why we published our Secure by Design guidance a year ago. We followed it up last October with an updated version with an even greater number of international partners, really emphasizing how every technology manufacturer should be taking ownership of their customers' security outcomes and making the internet a safer place for everyone.
Yeah, the automobile analogy is bracing when I sort of compare the, what the norms are in our society and our laws around liability for automobiles. You think about the formal recall process, et cetera, and compare that to software of all types. Just comes with this all caps, no warranties express or implied, no liability at the top. It seems like a difficult pattern to sustain when software has become so foundational to so many different parts of our civilization, right? Specific to this Secure by Design initiative and the work that you described, there was a specific moment just a couple of weeks ago at the RSA conference where 68 companies, including Tidelift, came together to sign a Secure by Design pledge. So I'd love to understand a little bit more. What are you hoping to accomplish with that pledge? What comes next from that body of work, and what's the purpose there?
Yep. So the goal of this pledge was really to put our Secure by Design principles into action. So in the guidance that we published, we laid out 3 Secure by Design principles, and these really are business goals that we encourage every business leader of software manufacturers to take. That's 1, taking ownership of customer security outcomes so that the burden isn't solely on them. 2, it's leading with radical transparency and accountability. We really want companies to be open about what approaches do and don't work so that others can learn. And then 3, leading from the top, we need business executives to make Secure by Design a top priority, recognizing that that's ultimately what's going to be needed to put this into place at companies. So while last year, and we still are focusing on guidance, we wanted to see how we could move to the next step of kind of catalyzing concrete actions by software manufacturers. And that's where we landed on the idea of a pledge. Could we bring together a critical mass of software manufacturers to agree on a set of specific items and work over a year to demonstrate progress on those? So after a few months of fine-tuning the language and socializing with companies, we landed on some language that I think is both measurable and ambitious, but also gives companies the flexibility they need to take an approach that suits their unique situation. And we had a really great showing. As you mentioned, 68 companies signed on at the event, in the week or so since then, we've already seen 25 plus more companies sign on. So I think we're only going to see more and more momentum behind this as time goes on. And the signatories include many of the largest software manufacturers in the world, many of the companies, for instance, that make edge devices, which CISA has been issuing recent alerts around kind of nation state activity targeting those sorts of devices. So we're excited about the pledge as a way to catalyze some action around the specific areas, which include things like reducing default passwords, reducing entire classes of vulnerabilities, recognizing that we can't really keep playing whack-a-mole with vulnerabilities. We need to take a more systemic approach, as well as having vulnerability disclosure policies to facilitate strong security research and exhibiting transparency in releasing vulnerability disclosures through, for instance, CVE records. And really kind of what all of this, I hope, will lead to is not only these actions, but kind of as specified in the pledge, to really make it clear that what companies are doing so that everyone can learn and do better from there.
Yeah, I love the physical signing ceremony in San Francisco that I had the opportunity to attend was made this a very pointed effort. I mean, like you could see the other humans who are signing this joint agreement. It made it all the more tangible, and I think it gave it a good launching off point where you know, in addition to committing to the public, there was almost a mutual commitment in that room. Let's get after this together, including, you know, organizations of all size represented there. So a great kickoff with the pledge. So the Secure by Design initiative, the pledge, corresponding pledge, this is all part of a broader overarching national cybersecurity strategy that was rolled out over the last year in the US. Can you just maybe connect the dots to that as well for us and help us understand how does this relate to that national cybersecurity strategy effort?
Yep, and really kind of what the kind of national cybersecurity strategy highlights is these two fundamental shifts that it calls for. One is to really shift the burden of responsibility in cybersecurity from those least capable, like individuals or small businesses, schools, hospitals, you name it, who we see today bearing the burden of many cyber attacks, to those who are most capable. And namely, that's the technology manufacturers who build the products that are used across all these sectors. And the second shift is really to kind of secure these technical foundations of the internet to scale out security improvements. So the work that we're doing with both Secure by Design, as well as our open source work, which Ava will get into in a minute, is super key to both of these areas. And we are really looking to see how we can make sure that is well understood what we expect software manufacturers to take on and lead to better security. And I'll also mention that we're working closely with many other partners across the US government, including the Office of the National Cyber Director in the White House, including the National Science Foundation, NIST, as well as some agencies that are really taking a leading role when it comes to open source security, like the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services.
Fantastic. Well, it's good to have a coherent framework, a policy and specific intent, and then as we do so often in engineering disciplines, decompose that into its constituent elements, and it seems to all be adding up in a fruitful and positive direction. So yeah, let's turn to the open source part of this, how open source software specifically integrates. And Ava, I'm delighted to have you here, given your long experience. You're a return participant at Upstream, so we welcome you back in your new role with CISA. And you know, I'd love to just start that conversation around how does this the overall policy here, intent of the U.S. government, and the Secure by Design initiative specifically, how does that intersect with open source? I mean, in open source, sort of a different sense of you know, software producer. Of course, it's not all coming specifically from corporations in you know, traditional product form, and yet it is a product, it is an ingredient and a part of the supply chains of almost every organization that's building with software today. So maybe give us a little bit of an insight into how you're leading the conversation around how open source intersects with this Secure by Design program.
Yeah, perhaps it's easier to start with sort of that first time open source was included in the national cybersecurity strategy about a little over a year ago. Even back then, you could see the way it fits with Secure by Design goals that Jack was just describing, to the recognition that open source is broad. It is both very often a production of corporate collaboration, companies, their employees publishing open source, or companies releasing open source so their customers have an easier time building products, engaging with them, to individuals just publishing their own tools or collaborating on a hobby project, and everything in between. And that the responsibility for making open source secure enough to use in critical infrastructure needs to be shouldered by those capable, not the hobbyists, not the volunteers, but the companies that are choosing to integrate it, to select it as a source for the products they're building and putting in the marketplace. So from that, or following the Secure by Design goals, you can think of that responsibility to safely consume open source. And we published a guide with the NSA and a number of other both public sector and private sector partners under the Enduring Software Framework last December, outlining a pretty structured process by which companies, admittedly the process is large enough, it's very suitable for large enterprises, maybe not as much for a small startup, but the principles can still be learned from for any company. If you're using open source, you should do so in a responsible way that helps to make sure you're updating it, you're patching it, you're keeping up when vulnerabilities are announced, so you know when to update. And as part of being a responsible consumer of open source, companies also need to contribute back in some way, whether it's time, treasure, or talent, to sustain the project. And for companies that may choose not to do this themselves for whatever reason, I would suggest integrating that principle into their supplier procurement. Pick a company, if you're using an open source distro or a vendor that's including open source in their products, ask your suppliers even to be doing this on behalf of the projects that they're including. So really it all sort of as part of Secure by Design and that overall effort, we want to see more companies recognizing the value that they get from this community resource and supporting that community.
Wonderful. Well, I'd love to dig a little deeper on that theme, and to specifically bring into the frame a recent incident that happened around a widely used open source component, the XZUtils package, which has been a topic of a lot of discussion around open source software supply chain security broadly, as well as a number of the sessions at Upstream today. So I noticed that CISA published a blog post, in response in the context of this XZUtils breach, and I just wanted to read some of the language there, which is contiguous with other language I've heard from CISA on this topic. So y'all wrote that this compromise highlights a fundamental shift needed. Every technology manufacturer that profits from open source software must do their part by being responsible consumers and sustainable contributors to the open source packages they depend on. In line with our Secure by Design initiative, the burden of security shouldn't fall on an individual open source maintainer, as it did in this case to near disastrous effect. Rather, companies consuming open source software must contribute back either financially or through developer time to ensure a sustainable ecosystem where open source projects have a healthy and diverse maintainer community that is resilient to burnout. So that's very much in line with some of your comments just now. That was the written response to this on the CISA blog. So I guess my question there is just, what is the role of CISA in driving this behavior, right? It's one thing to sort of express the opinion that organizations should be acting in this responsible way as well, but what is CISA's role or the government's role in actually changing the behavior, the status quo there? Is it just a matter of demonstrating the path and cajoling them into it, or is there a role for more formal requirements to drive this behavior? After all, going back to the analogy we talked about before, in the automotive industry, it's not just a suggestion to follow these safety procedures and guidelines. It's a requirement, right? So how does that square with this different kind of supply chain rooted in, especially the projects like XEUtils that are rooted in independent volunteer open source maintainers?
Well, first off, the solution, the detection of the XE compromise in this case was also found by another volunteer, a test engineer who's been benchmarking Postgres. Looking at XE wasn't his job. It wasn't a security researcher for that. So it is through the very openness and transparency of the open source communities and their ability to collaborate with each other that this was found. I would hope that's a good enough reason for companies when they're deciding how to allocate their resources and support their engineers' passion to sustain open source, to remember that this is so important for us all to work together to keep these projects safe and supported. As Jackie already talked about, the Secure by Design pledge was an iterative step from the announcement a year ago.
Makes sense. So we're headed in the right direction, and I certainly agree with your suggestion there that this is not the XEUtils incident is not a indictment of open source, but it's actually a proof point of open source in the sense that if this vulnerability had been present in a closed source product, it would have been much less readily discoverable. So it demonstrates, I think, the inherent some of the inherent resilience of open source communities, especially actively communities with sufficient active participation and enough folks developing on and with the technology. It demonstrates that open source is perhaps inherently more secure than traditional proprietary software.
There are a couple specific things we have done recently to your question. One was we held our first open source security summit in DC, bringing together a number of package managers and Linux distributions to talk about the steps they are taking and what they could do more of, and to try and help set a standard or baseline that all of those groups can follow, and also understand the differences between them, because some package managers or package repositories have technical differences. The same approach to security at one doesn't necessarily work at the other. So we had some great discussions there and worked with the OpenSSF Securing Software Repos Working Group on those principles. We also held what I think was the first tabletop exercise for open source to facilitate a discussion about incident response. Were there to be a coordinated or well-resourced actor trying to compromise open source? That was about a month before XE hit the spotlight. And so one of the steps we began to take then and are continuing now is to have a collaboration channel for the security contacts at some of the larger open source projects and foundations, should they ever need our help, our assistance in response to something. CISA is making that available.
And the one other thing I'll add here is that kind of one of the terms we float around is this idea of a secure by demand approach, where we want there to be actual market incentives to good behavior. And that includes being kind of, as you mentioned from our blog, both responsible consumers and sustainable contributors back to open source software. So our hope is that, for instance, with the Secure by Design pledge as a starting point, we can start to give organizations that are buying software more resources to ask the right questions of their prospective vendors. And we also joined on to something that's called the minimum viable secure product, which is really kind of a set of questions to ask an organization at the point of procurement, and gets towards a lot of these secure by design ideas. So we want to see, especially when it comes to the open source aspect, how we can encourage organizations buying software to start kind of asking those good questions. And certainly things like software bill of material, SBOM, can help in fostering greater transparency there.
Love this idea of security by demand in addition to security by design, work from both ends of the problem space. And certainly I've seen some of that security by demand energy and some of the new supplier requirements that the US government has put in place for companies selling software-based products to the US government itself. So I think maybe walking that walk in addition to talking the talk is really constructive. And all these other initiatives that y'all have detailed in the last couple of minutes. So maybe trying to zoom out a little bit and connect. We've been focused on open source software security and several of these efforts there. Previously, we talked about the sort of policy context for all of this, and maybe just to try to take another run at connecting those together. I would observe that just 2 years ago, the US government passed a $400 billion bipartisan infrastructure bill focused on many aspects of the nation's infrastructure. And here at Upstream today, we just had a talk from Professor Frank Nagel of Harvard Business School on a study that he led and his group led at HBS about the value of the open source software infrastructure that we rely on. The headline number there is they attributed a value of $8.8 trillion to the open source software commons that organizations rely on. So my question here, I guess, is, if government has a role in investing and sustaining infrastructure, what is the role that the US government should play in sustaining the open source software infrastructure? Is it parallel to traditional physical infrastructure like roads and bridges and airports, or is this something different? We've talked a lot about some of the efforts already underway, but what do you see on the horizon here connecting and bringing this new sense of infrastructure or more recent sense of infrastructure into the same lens as that traditional, billion-dollar infrastructure national investment?
Yeah, that's a great question. And we do know, for instance, this is something we acknowledge in the open source software security roadmap we published in September of last year, laying out CISA's direction on open source security. We know that open source software is heavily depended upon by every critical infrastructure sector. It's everywhere, and that's why we're approaching it at CISA as an area that is very much in our core mission to help protect both for the federal government and critical infrastructure that rely on it, but also given kind of our global economy and infrastructure. So as laid out in our open source roadmap, really the starting point from our perspective is understanding what we are most reliant upon. So we've set out to understand the prevalence of both open source software used within the federal government as well as critical infrastructure, because we need that to inform if we are to try to kind of take more targeted actions to help sustain various dependencies in the future. But as I'm sure many here know, it is not an easy task to understand what open source software we're dependent upon. We're taking a few approaches, looking both at operational technology as well as kind of more standard IT systems. So that's one area. And then the other thing I'll note is we want to see how we can model the right behavior at CISA, whether that's being better stewards of the kind of software and open source software we're dependent on at CISA, or some of these broader ecosystem actions. Ava mentioned our work helping secure software repositories, these entities that pretty much everyone in the world goes to use and download open source software packages. We think they're a really great place to scale out security improvements across ecosystems. We also know they're a target for attackers, and they're often resource constrained. So we want to see how, as CISA, as the US government, we can offer the right support. And for us, the starting point there is helping kind of centralize around, okay, what are the right security practices that should be taken, and working with them on those. Fantastic.
Well, one of the developments since we last convened for Upstream is last summer there was a very specific request for information put out on the topic of open source software security, specifically areas of long-term focus and prioritization. I believe this was a joint RFI put out by CISA and your partners at the Office of the National Cyber Director, the ONCD. So Tidelift, we were one of many organizations of all types that responded to that. Curious if you can tell us a bit more about the impetus for that request for information, and then maybe provide any update on where that project or that initiative is now, or what comes next out of that body of work.
Yeah, I can maybe kick off with some of kind of the motivation behind it, and then let Ava talk a bit about kind of what we've seen coming out of that. But really kind of the goal of this was recognizing, and kind of as part of our broader open source strategy, we know that as the US government, we have not engaged with the open source community as much as we should have in the past. So really one of our core goals was to see how we can kind of cast as wide a net as possible to get input into how we as the US government, and a lot of this was coming out of Log4Shell and kind of some of the thinking there, which was a wake-up call to many in government, but of course highlights some of these kind of long-standing areas that we're all too familiar to many in the open source communities. So we put this out in order to really get feedback on a number of areas from anyone in the world, anyone in the open source community, and wound up getting over 100 substantive responses. But really, the thinking was and continues to be that we need to kind of not try to show up and control the open source community or regulate it or anything like that, but rather show up as a community member. And this RFI, I'd say, was the start of kind of our approach to really kind of gather input and see how we can do this in a way that is, again, providing value to the open source community and not making things harder.
Yeah, and the just to second what Jack said, it started a little before I got involved. The effort to engage with the open source community and really understand and get that knowledge more widely shared among government employees and legislators through the ONCD, start a lot of those discussions of what the best approach could be to show up and to support the existing work. We've got, what, 30 years of innovation and history and collaboration here, and really modern infrastructure, as you pointed out, and Frank was discussing a bit earlier. Like, so much of our economy, our country, depends on this body of open source work and the people who contribute to it, whether as volunteers or as employees of a corporation. The genesis of the RFI was not to try and regulate or take too heavy-handed an approach, but to understand that diversity of basis of why people work in open source, what can be done to help protect infrastructure without impacting too negatively that collaboration.
Well, it's been a remarkable change in tenor from my perspective to see the way that the U.S. government is engaging with the open source community, with all the different kinds of vendors, the suppliers and the consumers in the open source software landscape. So really impressive, and just genuinely appreciate each of your individual efforts contributing to this mission that we have together as a civilization beyond the United States, of course, depending on open source software. But it's great to see the leadership from this important perspective. You both talked about community and collaboration in your remarks today. That's what Upstream is all about. So what we're doing here is bringing together in our particular format the organizations that consume and rely on open source, as well as the maintainers who are contributing to open source, especially the independent maintainers where it's not their traditional day job. So maybe I'll just, as a last question here, any specific advice you have for either or both of those stakeholder communities, the organizations consuming open source or the open source maintainers who make all of this possible by creating and then sustaining the software that so many organizations, including the US government, rely on?
Open source communities are all about relationships, right? The people who do the work. Trust is not a binary. It is not that a computer is trusted, but rather when we talk about that, is this safe? Is it trusted? It's a proxy for the relationships to the people who build and maintain that computer or that system. So if you're using open source, get involved, develop that relationship, or look to technological tools that can show and, excuse me one second. It's still allergy season here in Seattle. That can demonstrate the trustworthiness of that network. Back in the old days of open source, we all used PGP keys and had key signing parties and had a cryptographic web of trust. Some communities still rely on that. There are other techniques that are being developed today in open source communities or by open source communities to help surface that relationship. So if you're using open source today as a consumer at a large company or a small company or a local infrastructure, power water company that is just using open source because it's more efficient, it's cheaper for your business, still start looking at the tooling that the community is producing and is iteratively improving, such as, if the package is signed, if there is a scorecard value for it, or in toto attestations. There's a lot of these new tools being developed to help surface up the trustworthiness of a project at a given point in time based on a lot of, again, volunteers working together to track and measure these relationships. And it's not foolproof. It's not perfect. There are bugs in all software. Open source is still just software. So like any software, mistakes might happen. But through working together and maintaining those relationships, it's pretty darn good. And if you're a developer who's struggling to get time to go support the projects you care about or that your company needs, I don't know, I'd say point folks at the point your managers at the Secure by Design work and pledge and say, hey, look, we should get involved. We should keep this going because it's better for all of us.
I'll just add, if you have thoughts or opinions on anything we've said today, please do get in touch. Open source at CISA.dhs.gov. We also have a website with our open source work, CISA.gov/OSS. Always looking for more feedback and ways we can improve the principles for package repository security framework we mentioned, as well as a continuously iterate document and open for feedback on that too.
Perfect. Well, once again, we come back to both not just technology in toto attestations and things like that, but also the human element, right? The allusion to the PGP key signing parties, reliance on actual human relationships, and a reminder that there's people on the front end of this system. And I appreciate the leadership of each of you and of CISA and the US government's other initiatives around open source software supply chain security. Thank you for the work that you do, and thank you for joining us here at Upstream to talk about it and make this more visible, and to invite the community of users and creators of open source to participate in that conversation as we figure out how to ensure that we accomplish secure by design, secure by demand, secure open source. Thank you both today.
Thank you,
Thanks
Donald.
for having us.